Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. So, I could throw out a bunch of statistics to help validate my point, but we all know that cyber attacks in the industrial sector continue to rise and create new production, supply chain, and data management challenges throughout the industrial sector. And conversations on this podcast have covered numerous reasons as to why these numbers continue to grow, ranging from the new vulnerabilities being created by new IoT-based connection points and a lack of visibility within the OT infrastructure, to an insufficient number of OT security specialists and the constantly evolving nature of hackers and cyber gangs that are growing smarter and more complex. We've also discussed the need for transparency and sharing information related to ongoing attacks and the challenges they create, whether it be through regulation, industry standards, or trade groups. Well, our guest for today offers a great example of how one company is looking to arm manufacturers with data and insight that could prove invaluable in their developing and adjusting their cybersecurity plans to meet new demands. But before we talk to her, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Pentera. For more information on how automated security validation can help you safely test all your IT security controls with a click of a button in a non-stop industrial operational environment, visit Pentera.io. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dawn Cappelli. She's the Director of OT-CERT at Dragos, a leading provider of industrial cybersecurity solutions. Well, hey, Dawn, thanks again for joining us today. Welcome to Security Breach. Jumping right into it a little bit, what can you tell us about this operational technology cyber emergency readiness team? I know you guys just celebrated the first anniversary of it there at Dragos, but maybe you can fill us in a little bit on what CERT's about and what you guys are looking to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll start with kind of the history of why I chose to create OT-CERT for Dragos. I was the CISO at Rockwell Automation before I retired for 2 months, came out of retirement to start OT-CERT for Dragos. And as CISO at Rockwell, we started getting letters from small and medium-sized suppliers and large ones saying, we were hit with ransomware. We have no idea how long it'll take to recover. It'll take at least a month before we can get you our product. And I realized that our own manufacturing was being put at risk by our manufacturing suppliers. And from a cyber perspective, I never considered them as a cyber risk to Rockwell. They didn't connect to our network. They didn't have access to any of our intellectual property. They just supplied components, things that we use to manufacture. But suddenly I realized they actually posed an operational risk to Rockwell. And so suddenly I did care about them, and so did our manufacturing organization. And so when we started looking at their cybersecurity posture, we found that a lot of the small and medium-sized suppliers, they were lucky if they had an IT security program, but they had no OT security program. And so then I started looking around for, okay, what can we recommend to them? And for IT security, there are resources out there, free resources for small and medium organizations, but there was nothing for OT security. And so that kind of became my soapbox issue as my last couple of years as CISO at Rockwell. Anytime I was in some kind of a CISO meeting or giving a presentation or doing a podcast, I would say someone has to help these organizations. And then Dragos came along and said, how would you like to help them? And so Dragos, the mission of Dragos is safeguarding civilization. And the company really believes in that mission. And our CEO came out, he wrote a blog, and he said, if we truly mean that we want to safeguard civilization, we can't just help the big companies that can afford to buy our products and services. We have to help the small and medium under-resourced companies as well. And so that's the purpose of OT-CERT. We provide free resources for small and medium companies, as well as really any organization that is an OT asset owner or operator. We provide free resources to help them to build or mature an OT cybersecurity posture.
Wow. So desperately needed. This is music to my ears. We've been talking about this for the last year and a half on this podcast, so it's wonderful to hear that these type of resources are out there and available, especially focused on the small to medium-sized manufacturer. So getting back to the CERT program a little bit, Dawn, I know you mentioned ransomware a little bit. That was obviously been huge, exploding in terms of growth and frequency the last couple of years. Was it focused on ransomware? Were there other vulnerabilities that you maybe thought you could really address or help these small and medium-sized manufacturers deal with in establishing CERT?
Yeah, it's not just ransomware. When you think about it, think about critical infrastructure. Think about what would impact our lives. So our country has all of these small rural electric cooperatives, and they provide the power for a significant portion of our country. And those are small organizations. I was recently at a national cybersecurity conference for these rural electric cooperatives. And most of them, they are a team of one or two. And they're responsible for all of the IT, all of the security for the entire electric cooperative. And that's really scary. And so that's exactly the kind of organization that we want to help. There's also water. Think about water. A lot of water authorities, they're municipal, so they're very small. And that's another critical infrastructure that we can really help with OT-CERT. And then, of course, yes, there is manufacturing, there's chemical, pharmaceutical. If you just think about all of the small and medium businesses, we know like our economy is based on small businesses. And so I think it's important in any critical infrastructure sector. The thing is, we know that the sophisticated nation state threats, they're probably looking at the bigger companies. But the ransomware attackers, those ransomware groups, they're hitting anyone they can. And what we found recently, Trend Micro actually put out a research study in February of 23, and they really did a deep dive into Conti and Lockbit because those are the two most prevalent threat groups that are hitting that have the most ransomware victims. And Conti, they found that 69% of their victims had less than 500 employees. Lockbit, 80% of their victims had less than 500 employees. So these ransomware groups appear to have discovered that the large organizations are harder to get to now. They've been spending a lot of money on security. Ransomware was good for CISOs in that way. It was easier to get budget. But the small companies, the medium organizations, they just, they're easier to hit, and they are taking advantage of that.
Absolutely. I'd be curious, when you're reaching out to some of these smaller manufacturers, trying to get them more educated and more support more cybersecurity investment, what's been the typical response? Is it confusion? Is it overwhelming, or are they embracing it at a greater rate now maybe than before?
It's a little frustrating because, they, first of all, we're having a hard time getting their attention. We've been around a year. We have over 1,000 members in OT-CERT in more than 50 countries around the world. So that's nice. That's a lot. But when you compare that to how many there are, would like to reach a lot more. So the first problem is, how do you get their attention? Because they're not paying attention to security. They aren't following any of us on LinkedIn. And so the first problem is getting their attention. So we've been really focusing on that, on partnering with the ISACs, some of the industry groups, to try and get the word out to them. Then we get to them. So now, to answer your question, how do they feel about it? First is raising awareness, like telling them the statistic about the ransomware. They're coming for you. Don't think, why would they come after us? They're not looking for who to go after. They're just hitting anybody they can. So raising awareness is one thing. Then they get it, but they have to figure out, okay, so how do we do this? We're a small company. We don't, some of them, they outsource their IT. They don't even have an IT team. And so how are they going to implement this OT security practice? So what we did was everything that we've put out in the first year was really geared at incident response. Let's prepare you if you get hit, especially since the risk is so high. Let's prepare you to be able to respond. And so we put out resources and said, this is so easy to use. You can just hand this to a plant engineer. They can go out, they can capture your asset inventory. Here's a spreadsheet. They can fill it in. They know what's in their plants. Setting up host logging in your plants. A lot of companies don't have any logs. So if they get hit with ransomware, there's going to be no way to figure out how did they get in. Because if you just bring the plant back up and you don't know how they got in, they're just going to get right back in again. And we created a video that literally, it's so easy. You could hand it to a high school student. They could go into your plant, just follow the video, click here, type this, check these boxes. And now you have your logs set up and you have alerts set up so that if something significant happens, you'll know about it. So that's our goal, is to try and make it as easy as possible for them.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And, Dragos has put out, as you alluded to, a bunch of different reports, a ton of information. I've looked at a lot of it. And one of the bigger issues that's always alluded to is that lack of visibility within the OT system, understanding if somebody's in there. So taking these initial steps will at least, again, going back to the other point you made about larger manufacturers, making it a lot harder on those hackers to try to get in and do what they do.
And I was just going to say, one of my goals this year is to get the attention of the larger companies and to make sure that they understand what I understood when I was CISO at Rockwell, that these small suppliers and medium suppliers are putting your operations at risk. And so, they've been in the press. I'm not going to call out companies that have had to shut down their operations because a supplier was hit with ransomware, but it's happened multiple times in the last few months. Yep. And one of them cost the large semiconductor company, cost them $250 million in earnings. And it cost the supplier that was hit with ransomware $200 million. So now we're talking almost $500 million because of a supplier being hit with ransomware. So I'm trying to get the word out to the CISOs of larger companies that we need your help. We have free stuff here. All we need is for you to push this down to your suppliers and encourage or require that they start to build an OT cybersecurity program.
Yep. And we're going to include a bunch of links in the body, the description of this episode relating to CERT and identifying a lot of those resources that you have available just on the website. So hopefully we can help get the word out, because you're echoing so many things we've talked about on the podcast previously. And you kind of stole my next question, was to ask if you were working with some of those bigger suppliers, because with the way the supply chain is so integrated nowadays, everybody has more awareness of it. One, if you want to call it a positive byproduct of the pandemic, was everybody understands supply chain disruption now really, really well. So you can see how some of those smaller companies impact things on a much larger scale. So it's all that sounds amazing.
Yeah, if you look at some of the recent cyber attacks, like MoveIt, and we had Excellion when I was CISO at Rockwell. The threat actors they're looking at the supply chain. They realize that this is an easy way to get into my real target, either for espionage purposes or in the future, it could be for sabotage purposes. So I think it's imperative that we all focus on the supply chain. There's a lot of talk about it, but I feel like we need to see the action.
No, I'm with you there. Another thing I'd like to throw at you and just get your thoughts on. I saw a recent statistic from the Department of Justice. They claim that potentially as high as 85% of all cyber attacks go unreported. People don't want to talk about it, probably especially if it's ransomware. When talking to some of these smaller and medium-sized companies, well, the bigger ones too, I guess, how do we get more transparency there? How do we get people to share some of that information? I know there's some proprietary concerns there in terms of for how stockholders feel about putting bad news out in the paper or whatever, but how do we get to share more of this information and get over the fact that there shouldn't be so much negative assessment being placed on the fact that you were hit, but what can we learn from this in total?
Yeah, I know when I was CISO at Rockwell, we would get requests from customers who were hit with ransomware, and they would say to us, "We do not want this in the press. You have got to keep this quiet." Because of shareholder concerns, SEC scrutiny, there were a lot of reasons that they wanted to keep it quiet. I think we've seen from some of the companies that have been proactive about reporting what happened that it can be a positive thing. These cyber attackers are so sophisticated these days that we always talk about in the security community, it's not if, it's when you're going to be hit. And so I think we understand that as long as you haven't totally been negligent about your security program, we're all in this together. And so I feel like we really have to share information. Dragos had a security breach a few months ago, and we came out immediately and talked about what happened, how it happened, and it has been totally positive, the reaction to that. Yeah, that's how we have to be. We have to help each other.
Absolutely. No, we had another guest on the show as well, and they were hit. They're a consultant, cybersecurity consultant, and they had to come out and admit too, yes, we were hit, and follow sort of their own game plan. So leading by example is a big part of what we're trying to accomplish here. I'd like to get your thoughts on just a couple of other topics that sort of bleed into a lot of things that you're trying to do with CERT. I think one of the biggest issues, really big or small, is a lack of OT cybersecurity expertise internally. A lot of companies just don't have that talent. What have been some of your observations, or is there I know there's not a silver bullet solution out there, but where can we be better? Is it training people internally? Is it getting into the tech schools and demonstrating the possible career opportunities? Is it a little bit of both? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm kind of shocked, honestly, that there isn't more OT cybersecurity education out there. It's hard for companies. I can tell you at Rockwell, we were trying to figure out who are we going to have on our OT security team. You can't just go out and hire these people easily because there aren't many of them. And so if you're going to grow them internally, do you take IT people and put them into OT? Or do you take OT people and try and teach them security? And I think either way, just if you can find people who are interested, I would take either approach, because I think interest and passion to me are the primary qualifications for becoming an OT cybersecurity expert. But as far as education, I really am surprised that more universities, tech schools, that they haven't come up with programs that teach you both. There are tech school programs for learning OT and learning industrial control systems. Why not combine security with that? And now you're turning out someone that will really be marketable out there.
Absolutely. I think a little bit too, and maybe you'd have some thoughts here, it's almost paralysis by analysis a little bit in trying to determine who to put in that role. I think people or enterprises need to get into a mindset of we need to start just taking some steps forward. Any step forward, anything we can do to make the hacker's job a little bit more difficult is a positive movement, and we have to embrace that.
Exactly. When I was at Rockwell, we had security liaisons in each of our businesses. And in the manufacturing business, they had an OT person who, had a master's degree in some kind of engineering, industrial engineering. And she was not a security expert, but she started coming to all of our security meetings, and she became an excellent lead for our OT security program. Then she took another job, was promoted, and we thought, okay, now what are we going to do? And they proposed that we take someone from IT who had worked with our plants, so kind of had a little bit of background on the plants. Let's try moving him into the OT organization and make him our liaison. And he was excellent. So I've seen it done both ways, and both of those situations worked really well.
Yeah. It's interesting. You just mentioned taking an IT individual, someone who had an IT background, bring him over to OT. How do you think some of those processes relate? I think we've seen some issues with companies trying to take an IT approach, sort of cut and paste it over to OT, and it doesn't quite match up. What advice can you give to some enterprises who might be kind of stuck in that situation?
Yeah, I call it the IT OT cultural divide. It's like a chasm. And when I was at Rockwell, I worked with a lot of our customer CISOs, and that was the biggest problem. How do we get IT and OT to work together? And so what we did at Rockwell, when I first became CISO, we used the NIST cybersecurity framework to design our strategic roadmap for IT security. And then I figured, well, there doesn't seem to be anything out there for OT security, so let's just try to use the same thing, use the NIST CSF for OT security. So we had a week-long workshop. We brought in IT, security, we had networking there, identity and access management, incident response, just all these different IT and security people. And then we brought engineers, plant managers from some of the plants. And we all went through the NIST CSF together, walked right through every item. And at first you could see, like, even the way people sat at the table, IT was on one side, OT on the other side. So it was like, okay, here we go. We're going to clash. Yeah. And they did at first. But then, when we got to like vulnerability management and patching, and the IT team said, we do this all the time. We know what we're doing. We patch your computers every night on your desk and nothing goes wrong. Why won't you trust us to touch your plants? And then the OT, the plant engineers, explained, hey, this is different. We can't take any chances. You can't just start patching. You could bring down parts of the plant. And then IT said, well, okay, so we still have the tools to push the patches out for you. What if we work together, come up with a cadence? You bring the plants down like periodically for maintenance. How about if we do it then? We can still do it for you, but we'll do it when you say we can. And you can tell us which ones we can't touch. And so they worked together, and it was like a beautiful thing to see them kind of, I think it was, you could see the mutual respect. First, it was understanding, and then it was respect. Like, oh, okay, they're not a bunch of idiots who just, stubborn and don't want our help. They have a reason. And so it was actually a pretty neat thing to see.
No, it's good that the light bulb can go on there. We talk about breaking down those silos all the time with IT and OT and getting them to work together and sort of get past some of those turf wars. So that's encouraging to hear. And I think the industry overall has gotten a lot better there. I think there's been buy-in at the executive level in terms of merging those two parts of the enterprise and getting them to work together. So it's been a long journey, but I think we are getting there.
Yeah, one interesting thing that I discovered with OT-CERT was we have some big companies that are members, because anyone can be a member as long as you have an OT environment. And we have these big companies. And I talked to one of the members and said, I know your CISO. I know you have an OT security program. So why are you a member of OT-CERT? And he said, we're a large company of small fiefdoms, and every plant manager is the king of their plant, and they make the decisions. So they're responsible for the bottom line. If they don't choose to buy into the OT security program, then they don't have to. And so we're hoping that by offering them these free resources from OT-CERT, that we can get them started on the security path. And then hopefully they'll buy into the bigger program. So that was really an eye opener to me as well, because I think we talk about the security poverty line and how, we have the haves and the have-nots, but it's not quite so black and white is what I've found.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies, once they get in and they realize and they understand and are educated more about the environment and the situation, it's easier to validate those expenses and sort of move it up the food chain, if you will, and getting more support for it. Those first steps are so hard, which is why the CERT program is so important for so many companies right now. I'd like to get, Dawn, you have an interesting perspective in different roles and different perspectives you've had in the industrial sector and with cybersecurity. I'd kind of be interested in your thoughts on the role that government should or shouldn't play in terms of maybe, do we need to mandate more sharing of information when you're hit? There's a lot of regulation in place right now for utilities and critical infrastructure. Should some of that come to manufacturing, or are we better off governing ourselves?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I was at Rockwell before the SEC started imposing information sharing regulations. And, if you are hit, you have to tell them. And I just, I know, so I have that perspective of that fear of what is the government going to do when they find out. So I still kind of have that fear of government regulation.
Fair.
From my perspective, really now being embedded in OT-CERT and seeing small and medium and the risk that they pose to all of us, I feel like one area that I would like to see government involvement in is somehow help these organizations. We're providing all the free stuff, but they need, like I said, a high school kid could go in and could do this for them. How can we kind of create this group of people that are trained that and that the government pays to go in and help these companies to create a foundational OT cybersecurity program and IT cybersecurity program, quite frankly. They need both. They need IT and OT. So I would like to see the government, instead of that scary government, imposing regulations, I'd like to see them actually, let's help them. And I don't know where that money comes from. I'm not a politician, but I'd just like to see some kind of help. And I don't think it would cost a lot of money. You don't need very, very technical security experts to do a lot of these foundational things that these companies need.
No, I think it's a really interesting, the Biden administration has been very vocal in terms of pushing a cybersecurity agenda. We're still waiting for the dollars to sort of flow in behind it, though. So the talk is good, but now we need to walk it a little bit more.
Well, the thing is, when we talk about talent, we talk about it in the security community all the time, that an entry-level job in security requires 3 to 5 years experience. And I know people personally that have gotten out of school, non-traditional students who don't have that, they didn't do internships, they were changing careers, maybe as at a 30-year-old when they were 30, and they can't get a job. So they have a cybersecurity degree but can't get a job. So if we had some kind of, we talked about like technical schools, if they had programs where they are training these students in OT security, and then somebody's paying for them to go out and to actually, maybe they don't even have to pay them because they know they're going to need the experience to be able to get a job. So just go out and work with these small and medium companies and get that hands-on experience. And then you'll get a job when you get your degree or your diploma or whatever they're working toward.
No, a great point. I mean, we look at one of the biggest things is just having an inventory in terms of your connection points or API calls. You're right. It doesn't take a degree to start that process and to fill out a form, basically. So
yeah, and I mean, we provide like an incident response plan worksheet. And it's basically a Word document that has table after table after table. Who are your OEMs? Okay, you use Rockwell. Who do you call if you get hit with a cyber attack? Who's your contact at Rockwell? What's their phone number? And then you'll have your asset inventory that has all of your Rockwell equipment inventoried, so you know what version of the firmware were we running, what version of the product, what's our license key. You'll have all of that. Government regulations, who do we have to contact? How long do we have? What's the contact information for who we call? Just, who are our customers? Do any of our customers require us to notify them? Because that's increasingly common. So who are the customers that we need to contact if we get hit? Just, table after table after table, so you're ready if you get hit. You don't have to be a security expert to fill that in.
No, makes a ton of sense. Dawn, as we kind of draw to the end here, this has been fantastic. Again, really appreciate you taking the time. Do you see any big trends coming down the pike that we should really be aware of? You've had people talking about artificial intelligence, for example, some changes in cloud data management. Any other big trends you're seeing that could really have an impact on the industry?
I guess just the thing that strikes me is, for years, like since 9/11, I think we've been talking about what constitutes an act of war, from a cyber perspective. If someone would dare to attack power, what is the response, and what is the national policy and how we deal with that? Well, now it's happening. And now that it's happened more and more with the Ukraine-Russia war, I think it's the Pandora's box has been opened. It's happening now. And so I think that we have to realize that, like, our water authorities, our power, the chances of them being hit have raised substantially. Just the sophistication of the malware out there targeting industrial control systems escalated dramatically in 2022. So I think we just have to be aware that the risk is much higher than it has been in the past. And so we can't wait. We have to be prepared. And it's for the whole ecosystem, not just the big guys.
Yeah. I mean, we've had people on the podcast talking about that. They're hitting industrial control systems with supposedly politically backed intentions. But the reality is, when they're hitting a municipal water system in Israel, for example, that's not having just political ramifications. That's having social impact on millions of people. So it is definitely something we need to pay attention to.
Right. Exactly.
So last question for you, Dawn. I was on a podcast recently talking about manufacturing, and we have challenges. It's skills gap. There's cybersecurity concerns like we've been talking about here. And I was asked, so how do you stay positive about the things that you're doing in the industry as a whole? What are how do you sleep at night type of question? I know how I answered it, but I'd be curious to know, how do you answer that type of question?
Well, how do you sleep at night? That's why I retired. Yeah, boy, I try and spread the word now. Like CISOs, I don't think people understand the pressure, the constant stress that they are under. It is really hard to sleep at night as a CISO. I can tell you that from personal experience. But as far as staying positive, I guess, you can look at it and say, well, ransomware was hitting bigger companies, and now they're having a harder time getting to the big companies. They've had to go down to the small and mediums because it's harder to hit the big ones. So that's a positive note. I think CISOs were successful in getting security dollars for the past few years because of the prevalence of ransomware and the feeling that they'll hit anybody. This isn't just, it used to be power, oil and gas. We knew the sectors that were targeted by ICS attacks. And then ransomware changed that picture. So, I think you can look at it that, well, they have to go after the small and mediums now. The big ones are harder to get, but that doesn't make the small and mediums feel any better. And that's part of your ecosystem. So, yeah. So that's all I can offer.
Well, and the way I answered is basically, I mean, manufacturing has a legacy of being challenged with a number of different things, whether it's foreign competition, inflation, energy costs, all of that. We figured it out. It may take a while. And what I've seen, even just in the last 2 years, the attitudes and the dialogue about cybersecurity within the industrial sector has changed 180 degrees. So if we continue to make those improvements, I think we'll be okay eventually. So.
Yeah, definitely. When NotPetya hit, that was a big wake-up call for manufacturing, because until then, everybody felt like, we make cookies, we make, soda pop. Who would ever hit us? And then all of a sudden, boom, they will hit us. So that was a wake-up call, and there was a big response, and we've improved significantly since then. So yeah, that is the silver lining, I guess.
Dawn, thanks so much for joining us today. And to learn more about Dragos, you can check them out at dragos.com/OT-CERT. That's CERT. Thank you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Dawn Cappelli, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.